We may bring you the following recording of today's address by Ann Armstrong, Counselor to the President, speaking in the series of Landon Lectures on public issues here at Kansas State University. Mrs. Armstrong is the highest-ranking woman in government. She's the first woman to be a speaker in the Landon Lecture series. The title of her address, The Crisis and the Challenge. Mrs. Ann Armstrong.
I can't tell you what a great welcome I've had here in Kansas, particularly in Manhattan, but I do have one small complaint. I heard that about 3.5 years ago, when President Nixon was here in this distinguished forum, his congressional colleagues gave him a purple and white tie. Well, nobody's made that offer to me yet, but I'd like to make a deal with you. If you'll offer me a purple scarf, and if K-State beats KU, I'll wave it from the White House steps. As you could hear from the introduction, I have been involved in politics and government for a number of years. And just a few years back, I used to often say to audiences, when speaking of women's role in politics, in parties, that yes, we were counted on for the nitty-gritty. We stuffed the envelopes, we made the coffee, we took the brochures door to door. And I used to say, the cock croweth, but the hen delivereth the goods. But now things have changed in politics, in government, in your student government here in Kansas State. They've changed throughout our country, not rapidly enough to suit us women, but I am particularly honored by this milestone today, which allows a woman's voice to be heard at the top in one of the most prestigious lecture series in the world. As I prepared for this convocation, I was struck by a certain significance. It's on a day which, as you all know, we set aside to commemorate a great American, President Abraham Lincoln. And here it occurs under the watchful eye of Alf Landon, America's most distinguished elder statesman. These two men, at separate moments in American history, share so much of what our nation is all about. Like President Lincoln, Governor Landon tasted the exhilaration of victory as well as the heartbreak of defeat. Like Abraham Lincoln, Alf Landon is the product of America's heartland, the best America has to offer. But even more importantly, I think, Governor Landon and Abraham Lincoln share in the noblest quest of all, the quest for peace. For President Lincoln, that quest was at the dark hour of our history when the Union confronted its most painful test. But Lincoln sought peace and he attained it. With that peace, he preserved nearly a century of American history, and he prepared the nation to come for centuries of an even greater history. Alf Landon didn't command armies. He didn't assume the highest post of national leadership, but his quest has been every bit as important. He has expended great ethical and moral treasure for the cause of conciliation and international brotherhood. His life has been a living symbol of the search for peace. And so I think how appropriate it is that on this same day we can lift up tribute to not just one, but two gifted patriots and statesmen without whom the lives of every American citizen, and indeed every citizen of the world, would be measurably diminished. We Americans have traveled a tremendous distance. I don't mean simply in a physical sense, though, of course, through our history, we moved our nation westward, we expanded our frontiers and linked the continent. In a much more profound sense, however, we have traveled the distance in moral, cultural, and spiritual terms. Each step over that road has been faced with challenge and with crisis. We come to the present where in some instances the crisis and in all instances the challenge still face us as importantly as ever before. We are approaching America's bicentennial. And as we do, we think about the path our country has taken. It is a time for looking into the past, even as we look to the future. Several months ago, the President asked me to serve as his personal representative to the American Revolution Bicentennial Commission. Since then, it's been one of my most exciting and rewarding tasks in Washington. It's proved to me without a doubt that great things are going on in Washington, even in the most difficult of times. And these times have been difficult. And many's the day that I've thought in these last few months of a story that a congressman friend of mine told me as he was heading for Washington the same time I was, taking his family away from Houston, Texas for the first time, making the big move to Washington. And his last night at home, he was going around the bedrooms, and he got to his youngest daughter's bedroom, and she was just finishing up saying her prayers. And she said, "God bless Mom," and "God bless Dad," "God bless Domino," and that was the dog. And then there was a long pause, and she said, "And goodbye, God, we're going to Washington." But working on the bicentennial has been one of the most inspirational things for me I've ever done. And because there are so many young people in this audience for whom the bicentennial and how we celebrate it will have a great impact on your lives, I would like to share some of my thoughts on the bicentennial on this anniversary, which we will celebrate 2 short years from now. But first, let's take ourselves back a minute, back to the time of the Revolution. There were 13 dependent colonies, divided by time and distance, divided even in their desire to break the ties with Great Britain. We hadn't much of an economy then. We were a small, poor country dependent on others for many things. We were a nation of farmers, of artisans. We lacked any real significant industrial capacity. Yet there was a spiritual bond which united these divided colonies, which exists today and which has carried America through its great history. This bond is known by us all as the spirit of '76. What was that spirit? Indeed, what is that spirit today? It's a spirit of liberty coursing through our national veins. It's the knowledge that one man's freedom, one woman's freedom, is the most precious thing there is on earth. It's the spirit of sacrifice, sharing burdens and conflicts. It's the spirit of optimism, knowing that things can be better. It's the spirit of the frontier, of not fearing to go where man has never reached before. It's the spirit of confidence, of not being constrained by earthly boundaries, and of the certain knowledge that man can master his fate. It is the spirit of diversity, of allowing everyone his own view and his distinctive ways, and not only of tolerating the differences in our society, but of welcoming them. Indeed, the spirit of '76 was and is many things, each of which has been a building block of our national greatness. Our country grew on that spirit, and it prospered on it. And when all else failed, it was that spirit that guided us and kept us strong. But even with that bond, that spirit, I doubt very much that our founding fathers could have possibly conceived where those 13 weak colonies would go. Though their vision was not canted by the short term, I doubt they could have grasped the distance we would eventually travel. In the 19th century, we grew from an agrarian country into an industrial country. Let's look back to our centennial celebration, our 100th anniversary. I think it gives us a telescopic view, a snapshot of what America was after its first 100 years. Our centennial celebration was one big splash. It was held in Philadelphia in 1876 when there were 40 million Americans, when Kansas had only come in as a state in the past decade. Kansas State University, the first land-grant college, in 1863. And in those days, growth, expansion, progress were the watchwords of the centennial. No longer were we worried about our very existence. The 1876 celebration was America's first World's Fair, and the top attractions were the inventions which gave our citizens a glimpse of the future. There was Alexander Graham Bell's talking box, a very strange and ingenious device which defied nature by carrying the voice far beyond any sensible distance. There was the Corliss steam locomotive, an engine 40 feet high, probably the spaceship of its day. There was a new fancy carbonating drink being peddled by a fellow named Charles Hires, and it was called root beer. And there were Mr. Singer's sewing machine and Pullman bursts and the fantastic agricultural machinery that put American agriculture years ahead of the rest of the world. What amazing progress in technology had been achieved in the first 100 years of our country. But there were some problems as well. The Union had been saved, but the country was going through a divisive period of shock. It was the Reconstruction era. It was a time when America was supposed to be healing its wounds, but the wounds festered as we struggled to achieve that goal. For too many, the Civil War had never ended. Then, too, there'd been an economic panic in 1873, and the country was in the grips of a depression in the celebration year of 1876. These and other problems faced our country on our 100th birthday. But what a people we are. Americans 100 years ago didn't fold up their tents and sulk and walk away from their troubles. Instead, we reached back to that spirit of 1776 and sought once more those attributes of optimism, confidence, and sacrifice, and we continued on. Now we approach another 100 years, and we'll be asking some of the same questions that our citizens were asking during the Philadelphia celebration. In the midst of all our technological advancement, in the midst of all our materialistic success and our sophisticated gadgetry and our communication system, how can we be in so much trouble? Virtually every American institution is under attack. Our national debate has become bitter and rancorous. Our economy is under stress. We can't drive our cars because we can't get gasoline. We shiver in our homes to preserve the energy which provides our heat. Our food costs more. Our homes cost more. We think our cars are too big, and we think our paychecks are too small. The judiciary says that the courts are overcrowded. The legislature says that the executive branch has usurped its power, and the executive says that the legislature should have thought of that when it asked the executive to wield that power. Are we going to be thinking about these problems as we approach the bicentennial? I hope so. But I also hope that we don't think about them to the exclusion of the great things we can do in 1976. We have three meaningful themes that have been adopted to run through our bicentennial. The first theme is heritage. We will reaffirm the principles of our founding fathers. The second theme is festival, the fun part of the bicentennial, a celebration of the present, of the greatness of America. And the third theme is horizons, looking toward making America better, toward continuing the revolution which has never truly stopped. We'll be doing some extraordinary things during this period. Primarily, the bicentennial is going to be a human celebration. You won't be able to fold it and spindle it. You will be able to touch it and feel it because it's going to be a part of all of us. The Bicentennial Commission has been in contact with thousands of organizations, associations of every kind. Hundreds of cities and towns and Indian tribes have been invited to join the Bicentennial Communities program since it was inaugurated last summer. And as of today, 370 communities have been designated. And within months, there will be thousands, one of which I am sure will be Manhattan in the very near future. While there is active participation, guidance, coordination from the federal sector, we would not really meet our expectations without tremendous support from the private sector, from the academic world, from labor, from business. To give you just one example of what a combination of businesses and other organizations is doing, there'll be a freedom train. It will be powered by a steam locomotive pulling 25 decorated cars. It will take the basic treasures of our country, or replicas of them, such as the Liberty Bell, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, to all our country, to every state, to Alaska and Hawaii via boat, and to stop at least 76 cities in a 21-month, 26,000-mile journey beginning in the spring of next year. Its stops will be within easy reach of 90% of the American people. I'm particularly proud, as you might imagine, of the role that women will play in the bicentennial. One of the great unfulfilled promises of our forefathers is equality of opportunity. We have labored long, and yet still, women, blacks, Spanish surnamed, others, in too many instances, do not have the equal opportunity to be really in the mainstream of American life. And so this meeting of 48 very diverse women's organizations, minority groups, different religious groups, AFL-CIO groups, business groups, meeting in Washington in December was greatly heartening to me. These women's organizations decided on bicentennial projects that they would unite upon and carry through together. They include an international women's arts festival and a women's history center. One of the other exciting things to me about the bicentennial is that, unlike our centennial, which was limited to one city primarily, unlike the early thinking in this celebration, which for months went along the lines that we would only celebrate our bicentennial in the 13 original colonies, the final decision has been that our bicentennial will be across our country. It will be in the homes and towns of every America. Every city or state participating will be doing something special, unique to itself, to contribute to the celebration. Here in Kansas, to take just a few examples of the myriad things going on here, and most of them just beginning to blossom. You're going to restore Fort Scott. Riley County is thinking of having a historical museum and an amphitheater. And, of course, K-State, with its special strengths of foreign students, is thinking of doing something special in the international area, which will be a first for this bicentennial celebration. These activities that I've mentioned are very much part of what the bicentennial is about. They are physical commemorations of our history. They are physical ways to try to make this a better country in the future. But the more important commemoration is going to take place in our hearts and in our minds. It means that we have to think about where we've been and where we have yet to go. It means asking some fundamental questions about ourselves, our society, our institutions, and our culture. We're a young nation in terms of history. It's hard to believe all that we've accomplished in this short span, But one of the faults of being a young nation is that we tend to think in short time spans, an instant, a day, a year. And if you look at the difference in the way the old countries of Western Europe, in a way a country like the People's Republic of China, even though a new nation based on a very ancient culture, they think in terms of 25 years, 50 years, 100 years ahead. And so that in 1976, I hope that America will think in more than the immediate sense, and in the larger sense of where history beckons us 25, 50, and 100 years hence. Where will the American spirit lead us? To begin with, I don't think there should be any basic turning away from the spirit in which we were founded. We look for a rejuvenation of purpose and commitment to fulfill the promises of our forefathers as yet unfulfilled, in a sense of anticipation what permits us and even demands of us to be better than we are and to aspire to more than we are. What I see as the main difference in this celebration is that at the birth of our country, what was on our citizens' mind was the very survival of our nation. At the centennial celebration, we were thinking about how to make our country mightier. I believe that at our bicentennial celebration, we should think about how to make our country better, how to give new meaning to what Thomas Jefferson called the pursuit of happiness, and which many call today the quality of life. The wonderful thing about America is that our problems can be solved. When we really sit down and think about it, many of our challenges, our crises, stem from so-called good problems, of affluence, of peace, of prosperity. We're the first nation in the world, militarily, diplomatically, and economically. With all this strength, we cannot fail to do more. We have the natural resources. We have the human resources. The big question is, have we the will to solve our problems, to tap the reservoir of the American soul, to rekindle the spiritual spark that blazed forth 200 years ago? Our gross national product has doubled over the last few years, but are Americans twice as happy as they were? New technology leaps at us with such alacrity as to startle the human mind, but has it contributed fundamentally to our stature as a people? We've gone to the moon and back, but have we gone to the well of life? These are the questions which haunt the future of America. Our cities may gleam with tall buildings, our farms may overflow with the abundance of our soil, our children may never suffer the illnesses we know today, and our leisure hours are expanding with a suddenness that would shock our parents and their parents. We have all this and more, but unless we now join this material progress with a renewal of our spirit and an enrichment of our soul, we may have nothing. That is why, as we enter our third century of independence, we'll be searching for more. We'll be looking for the anchors of life which perpetuate the truths which Jefferson called self-evident. We will look for the moorings which fasten freedom not only as a word written into our national charter, but as a condition which is brought to life by the way we go forward. We must be seeking new values, to be sure, but we must do so in a way which gives new meaning and sustenance to the values which have preserved our civilization through the stresses of war and domestic conflict. Where will the neighborhood be in the year 2076? Will it be maintained as a nucleus of our immediate environment, a better, cleaner environment, or will it be torn away in a coldly disintegrating disruption to our way of life? Where will the family be? Will we, as some prophets predict, tear down mankind's oldest social institutions? Or will there be new relationships between husbands and wives? And will we realize that the family must be reaffirmed as the mortar which holds our very existence together? Where will our spiritual beliefs be? Will they disappear in a smog of materialism, or will they be renewed to give us the strength to match what one author has called future shock? These aren't easy questions. They shouldn't be easy questions. So as we enter the year of our bicentennial, which officially begins next March, just a year away, we will be crossing institutional boundaries and generational lines. We will be looking forward to positive things which will enrich the quality of life and breathe new meaning into the pursuit of happiness. Even the past few difficult years give us cause for optimism for the future. Look what we've done in the last half-decade. A prolonged and dispiriting war was brought to an end for the American people in a way in which peace, as we were always asked, had a chance. Negotiation and détente replaced America's 20th century hazardous relationship with the Soviet Union. Doors were open to the largest nation in the world, doors to China, which was closed for so long. American agriculture has been freed of the shackles which kept it down and is the wonder of the world, not only for our own citizens, but for our international trade. Domestic tranquility has been brought nearer, and the bombings and arson and mass rioting of the 60s have been virtually non-existent of late. We can be thankful for all these things. But there still remains a full agenda which speaks eloquently of our national commitment to be ever restless, never satisfied. High-quality health care is a high priority to which your government will be devoting its immediate attention. New strides will be taken to strengthen the economy. We will move to reform education, to reform an outmoded welfare system which degrades so many of our fellow human beings. We can be thankful that we are not going to avoid the problems immediately ahead. Will we despair, or will we move forward toward the far future with hope? I think it will be the latter, because when the sea churns and the rudder quivers, we will look back to that spirit who brought us where we are today. We will reach out and find that optimism, confidence, and sacrifice. Weep for America? The answer is no. We will rejoice for America, because the crisis and the challenge of today are opportunities for a better, more splendid future. We can be guided by these words of Abraham Lincoln. Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it. With that faith, with America's gift of indomitable perseverance, we will see the light that draws us into history. And following that light, it is my conviction that on our 300th birthday, history will record the American people of today this way. They lived their lives with distinction. They lived their lives with honor. They found happiness because they pursued it with the strength of their fathers. Thank you very much.
Mrs. Armstrong, your audience has strikingly expressed its gratitude to you for an address that was thoughtful and eloquent, and I'm sure has added a new dimension of meaning and significance to the bicentennial activities as we anticipate them in the months ahead. Our speaker has graciously consented to answering some questions. Before I ask for the first question, I'd like to recognize two more persons in the audience, one of whom has already been referred to by our speaker. I'd like for Mrs. Alf Landon to stand now so that we can recognize her. accompanying Mrs. Armstrong to K-State for this Landon Lecture is her administrative assistant, who is also an alumna of Kansas State University, graduated from K-State in 1961, I believe was a member of the Student Council even before it was fashionable for women to occupy positions of high leadership. She's from Russell, Kansas originally. Judy Harbaugh, would you stand and be recognized? And now, would someone have a question to address our speaker? Yes.
What would you attribute to your success as a professional woman?
You know, I think I'm a living, walking example that particularly for middle-aged and older women, the doors aren't closed to a career. I think the girls here in K-State have more studied goals in life. They aim towards them. They think in terms of professions, of businesses. But in my era, I didn't. And I've been of great hope to women like myself because other than my BA degree, I did not have any professional training. I was a housewife and mother primarily for 20 years. I did do volunteer politics, but largely from my home in my county, a little bit through my state. So I would say that I find that men, particularly in government and politics that I know best now, are honestly trying to give an extra boost up to women. I think it was a very brave thing of the president to do, to choose me as the first woman counselor to a president with cabinet rank. I think if I hadn't done the kind of job he wanted me to, perhaps there would have been a diminution of duties or a little less than he called upon me to. But I don't know at this point of any pat answer to how a woman is a success. A woman can be a success in so many different ways, purely as a wife and mother, as a combination of a mother, wife, and career woman. But I do pay tribute to men now who are willing to forgive a woman's having had a lapse in a career, to raise children, to resume it, to give her a chance. And this realization now that a woman is every bit as intelligent, that a woman is every bit as creative, that a woman is every bit even as aggressive as the males. And we are in a period now where there'll be some necessity for help from the men to give us an extra hand up. I'd say within the next 20 years, 10 years even, there won't be any necessity for that little extra boost for the men.
Mr. Nixon, instead of the Union message, he asked that 1 year of Watergate be enough for the American people and to the Congress. But it seems to me that Mr. Nixon's unprecedented defiance of America's high ideals and its system of law has prolonged Watergate. Do you agree completely with Mr. Nixon's handling of Watergate? And if you do not, what have you suggested to him, or what would you suggest he do differently?
I remember what I suggested to him when I first learned about the existence of the tapes. The president was in Bethesda, recovering from that pneumonia bout he had then. And when I heard about the tapes, I said, thank heavens, finally this thing can be laid to rest. And I told the president that via a messenger, and then the president asked me to come out to Bethesda. And he spent about an hour talking to me then, and he described to me why he couldn't do what I wanted him to do. And what it comes down to is this. There are two people here. There's Richard Nixon, private citizen. And to me, to Richard Nixon, private citizen, it would have been all to his good to give them all the documents, to give them all the tapes, to give them whatever was needed to clear this thing up quickly. But unfortunately, Richard Nixon, as far as being a private citizen and helping himself, is also President of the United States, with a very deep feeling of the importance of confidentiality of the President and the separation of powers. And at that time, when he talked to me in Bethesda, I am convinced he was determined never to release the tapes or confidential presidential documents. But I think none of us could have foreseen how divided, how deeply concerned and troubled the country became. And so it came to weighing one good of the country for the future, preserving the separation of powers, preserving a president's right to hear the most candid, the most forthright, the best advice his advisors can give him in private, and pulling the country together when it seemed to be going in a shambles of divisiveness. And so he had to yield. And so I just pray that the price for future presidents has not been too great for the yielding this president has had to do. And let's not forget that someday that shoe might be on the other foot. And someday a judge might be demanding things for a head of a Senate committee or a president might be demanding something of a congressman that too would be injurious to the separation of powers which are so basic to this country. My personal feeling is that the president had absolutely no involvement in Watergate. I think that we have probably had all the disclosure necessary at this point as far as the courts and the Judiciary Committee doing their job. I believe that the evidence is in. I believe that it will show no grounds for impeachment, and I believe that the president will be vindicated and that he will then go forth to regain the confidence of the American people, which there is no doubt he has lost in large measure, in a measure very detrimental to this country, but that he will regain it, that he has the temperament, the courage, the vision to go forth under the most adverse circumstances with a federal energy conference in Washington, D.C. today, where the president is exercising a unique leadership that only Nixon could exercise, that he will go forward with his trip to Moscow to build upon our SALT agreements, to build on this structure of peace, and that he will have the courage and the vision to answer the domestic concerns of the people at home, which he addressed in the State of the Union message.
Question? Yes.
Good morning. From the campus of Kansas State University in Manhattan, the K-State Radio Network presents now an address by Ann Armstrong, counselor to the President, speaking in the series of Landon Lectures on public issues. Mrs. Armstrong, the highest-ranking woman in government, and incidentally, the first woman to appear in the Landon Lecture series here at K-State. Mrs. Armstrong is a Texan. She's been active in Republican Party politics for a number of years. In 1971, becoming the first woman to be elected as co-chairman of the Republican National Committee. In 1972, becoming the first woman to deliver a keynote address at a major national political convention. A year ago, she was appointed by President Nixon as counselor to the President, a cabinet post in which her responsibilities include youth, women, the Spanish-speaking, the Bicentennial, the New Federalism. Now for the introductions and to the stage, and Kansas State University President Dr. James A. McCain.
I'm pleased to extend a cordial welcome to all of you in the auditorium here at Kansas State University for this second address of the current academic year in the Alfred M. Landon Lecture Series on Major Public Issues. This happens also to be the 26th Landon Lecture to be delivered since this very rewarding and exciting series was inaugurated here at Kansas State University. I welcome with eager enthusiasm those who will watch this program over television It is being televised live by WIBW-TV in Topeka, and the Channel 11 Washburn University television station will carry this program next Sunday afternoon on videotape. I welcome also those in the very large radio audience this morning. This is Ladies' Day on the Landon Lecture series, and I'll have more to say about that in a few moments. But let me, at the outset of the convocation, introduce to you some distinguished people that we have on the platform. We are very sorry indeed that a pressing engagement elsewhere has made it impossible for Governor Robert Docking to be present this morning, but we are delighted and honored that the charming First Lady of Kansas, Mrs. Meredith Docking, can be a special guest here. And I suppose if on Ladies' Day we had to make a choice, Meredith, we would have made the choice that we came out with. At any rate, it's always a pleasure when the Dockings are guests on our campus, and I should like to have you acknowledge our First Lady of Kansas, who is not only a most gracious and charming person, but a genuine intellectual as well, Mrs. Meredith Docking. Seated on our left is Professor Joseph Hyder, who is chairman of the Student Faculty Convocation Committee and who is the coordinator for the Landon Lecture Series, and I'm sure you'd like to acknowledge Joe Hyder. In the final analysis, the most important people at Kansas State University are the students. And I think it's singularly appropriate that at these Landon Lectures we have on the platform and provide recognition for the president of the student body, especially when he's such a handsome dog as is Joe Knopp. So would you recognize Joe Knopp at this time? And if that reference to Joe sounds superficial, let me say that I have found Joe to be one of the ablest, most responsible and conscientious student leaders with whom I have ever been associated here at our university. These Landon Lectures, of course, were initiated for the purpose of recognizing one of the greatest men in the history of the state of Kansas, perhaps the greatest, a man who is recognized not only throughout Kansas and America, but throughout the world for his wisdom, for the wisdom and insight with which he comments these days on the great issues of our time, a former governor of Kansas, a nominee by the Republican Party for the presidency of the United States and the Republican candidate in 1936, and an elder statesman par excellence. And I would like for you to recognize at this time our special guest of honor and K-State's favorite and #1 adopted son, Governor Alf Landon. Governor, I trust that even though you will be viewing the event by television on Wednesday evening and not be here in person, that you'll wear that purple and white tie for the television of Wednesday evening's basketball game with KU. I know that you have, to some extent, divided loyalties, but I don't think they're too much divided to suit us. I don't know if you heard that or not, but he plans to wear 2 ties on Wednesday night. I think it's singularly appropriate that to introduce the first woman to deliver an address in the Landon Lecture Series, we have on the platform this morning the one female member of the Kansas Board of Regents. I'm referring, of course, to Mrs. John Hutton, or Mrs. Prudence, or Prue Hutton, as she's known to people here at K-State, and she is well known to people here at K-State because she's an alumna of our university, and we are very proud indeed of her many achievements, and especially of the fact that she's a member of the Board of Regents, the only woman on the Board of Regents.
Impromptu and Book Beat, usually heard at this time, will not be heard today so that we may bring you a recording of today's Landon Lecture on Public Issues, featuring Mrs. Ann Armstrong, Counselor to the President, speaking in KSU Auditorium this morning. Mrs. Armstrong was introduced by Mrs. Prudence Hutton, member of the Kansas Board of Regents.
It is a special privilege for me to welcome Ann Armstrong to Kansas and to my alma mater, Kansas State University. Mrs. Armstrong is the first woman to deliver an address in this distinguished Landon Lecture series. She typifies the emerging role of women in positions of leadership in public affairs because she occupies the highest office held by any woman in our national government. Mrs. Armstrong is a native of New Orleans. She received her A.B. degree from Vassar College and was a member of Phi Kappa Phi. For the past 22 years, she has resided on the
Impromptu and Book Beat will not be heard today so that we may bring you the following recording of today's address by Ann Armstrong, Counselor to the President, speaking in the series of Landon Lectures on Public Issues here at Kansas State University. Mrs. Armstrong is the highest-ranking woman in government. She's the first woman to be a speaker in the Landon Lecture series. The title of her address, The Crisis and the Challenge. Mrs. Ann Armstrong.
I can't tell you what a great welcome I've had here in Kansas, particularly in Manhattan. But I do have one small complaint. I heard that about 3.5 years ago, when